Hi there, Herle Burlyites. Pre-pandemic, we all spent a hell of a lot of time online, maybe too much. And if you're like me, you probably wasted some of it going down YouTube rabbit holes of grainy live performances of Mott the Hoople and T-Rex. Now the time we spend online has just exploded, doing essential things like working, socializing, teaching, and learning. Our presenting sponsor, TELUS, wants to ensure families with kids who would normally be at school aren't struggling with how they can continue learning virtually. So TELUS has launched a new Internet for Good for Students program for kindergarten to grade 12, offering high-speed internet at home. TELUS and local school boards have partnered to expand and expedite the process of bringing this critical connectivity to all students. The school boards, along with TELUS, will be responsible for identifying families in need of an internet connection at home and providing them a unique Internet for Good promotion code, which they can use to register for the program. This will give families low-cost, subsidized, high-speed broadband internet, as well as access to free educational activities through TELUS Wise and the Learn, Do, and Share Educational Hub in partnership with Microsoft. TELUS's Internet for Good for Students is just part of the TELUS Connecting for Good portfolio of programs. As we all adapt to our new normal, it's more important than ever to #stay strong, stay connected. Visit TELUS.com/COVID-19 to learn more. All right. Welcome to the Herle Burly, coming at you virtually from Zoom rooms all across this great country. I want you to know that there was a heated debate about whether or not we should be getting back together in our studio, all of us, to do this podcast. Some people argued that the business of the Herle Burly was just too important to the nation, not for us all to get together. And they tweeted some pretty nasty stuff about us not wanting to be accountable and us hiding. Cooler heads prevailed, though, and others felt the physical distancing version of the show works pretty well, is less dangerous, and sets a good example. Wherever you stand on that, Herle Burlyites, today for your political and pandemical listening pleasure, we're once again doubling down with a two-part podcast. First up, Ken Bosencool and Kevin Milligan. Ken is a founding partner of Cool Top and Guy Public Affairs, one of Canada's most successful conservative strategists, and played a senior role in 4 election campaigns under Stephen Harper and is now affiliated with the C.D. Howe Institute. Kevin is a professor of economics at the Vancouver School of Economics at UBC and is also affiliated with the C.D. Howe Institute and the National Bureau of Economic Research. They had a little mix-up on Twitter about some of the government's policies, and we invited them to come on and talk about that and a bunch of other stuff today. Part 2 of the pod is the political panel. You know them, you love them, you laugh and cuss at them harder than they laugh and cuss at each other. Jenni, Byrne, and Scott Reid. We'll pick up a little on what Ken and Kevin said, plus we're going to do a listener mailbag today. Some great questions over the last 3 days from you Herle Burlyites. Ken Bosencool and Kevin Milligan, welcome to the Herle Burly. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
I start with you like I start with everybody. How are you doing? Personally, how are you doing?
Good. I've been working from home on and off now for many years, so this isn't really a huge adjustment. What has been in the adjustment is I've lived in Alberta and done a lot of work in Ontario, so I haven't been traveling to Toronto, obviously, and been doing a lot of stuff remotely. Seeing a lot more of my granddaughter, who we've been helping her mother take care of over the last little while down here in southern Alberta and Lethbridge. But other than that, good, healthy.
Things are good here in Burnaby. I'm doing a lot of the regular workload of advising students, and we had a thesis defense this morning. And in addition to that, doing some emergency policy work and media hits like this, and so life is busy.
Kevin, how much are students getting ripped off by not getting classes?
I think everyone acknowledged that in March and April, we got stuff over the line to finish the semester here. I think everyone was willing to, accept that. I think when we get to September, if we're going to be delivering, education that is different than what they thought they were going to be getting when they joined up, I think there's a sense they're not getting what they paid for the undergraduates. I think that's a fair thing. I mean, so I hope that over the next, we have 3 or 4 months to figure this out, that we figure out a way to keep students learning.
Right. Yeah. It's becoming a long period of time. So listen, we had you. I don't want you to feel any pressure to fight with each other because, you're friends and you agree on lots of things. But we had you on because there was a little bit of conflict. The genesis was a little bit of conflict on Twitter, but I'm sure that we will find lots to disagree with. First of all, I think it was Pierre Trudeau that said that if you took all the economists in the world and laid them foot to toe in one straight line, they'd all still be pointing in different directions. Secondly, I'm a pretty disagreeable person myself, so I'll figure out some things to disagree with you guys about if you're not disagreeing with anything. But I would like to start off with a context-setting piece. You have both been distributing, certainly on social media, a lot of statistics about what you're seeing happening in the Canadian economy right now, and that CD Howe package that I think both of you commented on today was pretty compelling. Can you, in sort of layman's terms, tell us what's happening to the economy right now? How bad is this, and what are some of the indications of how bad it is?
Well, this is unlike anything we've ever seen. We're looking at something like 7 million people on unemployment insurance and the relief benefit already, and I don't think that's getting better. Just saw today that the local transit authority here, TransLink, is going to be laying off a large percentage of their workforce. So when you have, fairly stable employers like the transit authority laying off people, it's not getting better in the short run. And this is unlike anything we've ever seen, including going back to the Great Depression in terms of the speed and the magnitude of it. That's on the labor market side. And the overall economic activity side, similar thing. I mean, we have estimates of the GDP dropping, at least for the next quarter, in the range of 20 to 30%. Looking at those things in the CD Howe dashboard, that looks like it's not unreasonable. You have, restaurants going to zero. You have rail shipments going down substantially. You have electricity going down substantially. So this is unlike anything we've ever seen.
I'm going to answer that question in a slightly different way. I think, and it was one of the motivations for me putting forward what I call the crisis basic income, and that is we don't know. And when this started, it looked like a big, scary thing, and we faced it, and we really didn't know what the impact is. And I think that's true both on the medical side and on the economic side, that we don't really have a really good idea of who is going to be impacted and who is going to be hurt the most and the least. And if I can sort of jump ahead, that was one of my instincts when this started, for me to say, from a public policy perspective, how should governments react to this when we really don't know what we're facing, when we're facing something for the first time? The bias of government should be to distribute money to as many people as possible and then figure out who should have got it at the back end. So I call that, send out everything at the front end and determine who needed it at the back end. And the government has done something a little different than that. They've tried to figure out who needs it and design programs for them at the front end, and then as opposed to reconciling that on the back end. So I think the answer to the economic question is everything Kevin said is correct, and the numbers are slowly coming in and we're learning things, but we really don't have a deep understanding of what's going on. And I think that was a motivation for me to say, send money to as many people as possible and then reconcile this in the tax form next year.
What sectors do you think might have the most difficult time coming back from this?
Music. It's interesting. I mean, there's a bunch of entertainment industries that are doing well on the online stuff, but if you're an artist or someone who makes their living, and increasingly in a digital world, you make your living by live concerts. So the sports industry, the arts industry, I think the restaurant industry, I've been looking at some interesting data that said people stopped going to restaurants long before the government said they should stop going to restaurants. And I worry that people will continue to stop going to restaurants long after government says it's fine to go to restaurants. And so I think a lot of the things that we did before where we were close and touching each other, it's going to be difficult for those things to come back. I worry about everything's going to change stuff, but certainly things where economic activities that require people to stand close together or be close together physically, I think will take a lot longer to come back.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Thinking of tourism and the whole hospitality sector, I mean, people are not going to be going around as tourists for a while. And, I know Ken's a bit of more of a Van Halen guy than a Van Beethoven guy. But if you think of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra, where I do like to go now and then, I mean, when am I going to go and do that again? I don't know. So a lot of cultural organizations are going to be hit, as well as the music, the popular music stuff. The other thing I would note, the thing that's a bit more scary as I think about it, is manufacturing. I mean, think of Ontario specifically in manufacturing. The supply chains there are so delicately balanced that, depending on what goes on in Michigan and Ohio and other places south of the border and how quickly they can get back to work and stay back to work, that's going to affect what happens in Ontario. And I do worry that if we have, too early returns in the U.S., that there's second waves, things go badly there, that things will go on for a while.
Take a slight detour because it's something that obviously preoccupies me, being from Saskatchewan, which is the price of Western Canadian oil today hit zero or negative for the May futures, whatever moment you were looking at it. It was either zero or below zero for the May futures. I understand the May futures aren't the only way of measuring the price of the value of a barrel of oil, but let me ask you this question. Do you foresee a circumstance in which Western Canadian oil again commands $57 a barrel?
I think the global demand for oil and the global demand, especially for natural gas, will come back in time. Maybe not quite to the international forecast. The international forecasts still say that we're going to be using a lot of fossil fuels for a long time. Clearly, as Jason Kenney has even admitted, this is, eventually we're gonna move away from those kinds of fuels to other kinds of fuels. But I still think as we come back, that the globe is still going to need fossil fuels. I think the prices right now are reflecting obviously the loss of demand globally, and some of the silly, if I can say it that way, things going on the geopolitical level between Russia and Saudi Arabia that I think we'll try and sort out. But I do think we're gonna come back to some sort of normal. I think the big question for Alberta and Saskatchewan and parts of northern British Columbia is how soon do we get back to that, and how soon do prices get back to that. But I do think, with TMX being built and other things happening, Alberta will supply the world with fossil fuels for quite some time yet.
Yeah, I agree with Ken there. I mean, the weirdness in today's oil future market, if you look out past May to June, July, August, and later in the year delivery, you're seeing prices more in the range of $30 to $40 still. So the stuff today is more about this weird short-term glut and storage capacity than, long-run demand for oil. So I do think there is a future there, and being here in Burnaby, I can see the terminus of TMX from my house. Literally, I can see Burnaby Mountain out my window. So things are happening there. I've seen it with my own eyes. Things are getting built, and so there will be a time when hydrocarbons are flowing to Burnaby.
Okay, so let's go back then to this total shutdown of the economy. Scott Clark, the former Deputy of Finance, said the economy had been put into a coma. I want to ask you how consciously that was done. Do you think that governments expected the results they're getting economically when they put in place the shutdown?
David, you and I have both been in politics off and on for most of our lives, most of our working lives. And, I'm an economist and Kevin's an economist, but the reality is that economics is only one factor that drives public policy. And I think the answer to your question is, yeah, they were worried about that, but it was a pandemic crisis. So they had to respond to that. And in the immediate, like from the middle of February to the middle of March, whenever government started clamping down, I think the primary directive was, how do we protect our population? And I think from this health pandemic, And sure, there were a bunch of people in departments of finance going, "Whoa, how are we going to clean this up? And how's this going to affect what we do?" But I don't see a lot of people saying, people want to get the economy back, and there's a small group of people that are agitating to do that more quickly. But I don't think there's a lot of people who said we shouldn't have done this. This was a health directive first, and that was the primary directive.
For me, the answer really depends on what day you're looking at on the calendar, going back through February and March. Right into mid-March, I don't think anyone in government, I don't think anyone in the private sector really knew what we were about to hit. Now, as you hit later March, I think people at all parts of society, government, private sector, got a better sense of what was going on with the full coma that David mentioned. Just to give an example of that, on Thursday, March 19th, did an interview with a national newspaper I will not name, and they said, "Hey, how's the labor market looking?" And I said, from the numbers that I'm seeing and the anecdotal reports, I think we're going to see the worst month in the history of economic statistics in the labor market. And the reporter said, are you sure? I'm pretty sure. I mean, I'm just going with my what I'm seeing here. An hour later, he called me back and he said that his editor bounced that quote, "Not credible. Get someone else, or get them to, weaken it." And I was like, actually, that's what I see. And that was on March 19th, right? So we didn't know on March 19th, it was not credible to a national newspaper that we were going to see what we're seeing. And so, did government know what they were doing? I think the week after that, they had a much better sense. Things evolved very quickly over those days. But when we were in the first part of March, I think we thought we had a health crisis, want to maybe make some investments there, do some things for a few people unemployed. But I don't think we were anticipating having, 7 million people on an emergency relief benefit when we were on March 15th.
I was dealing with different parts of the media conglomerate at the time, and I wrote a tweet on March 15th and went to bed. And the tweet, I don't have it in front of me, the tweet basically said, we should have a crisis basic income that should be distributed to all Canadians, or as many as we can possibly reach, and then we'll tax it back next year. And then I went to bed. And the next morning I woke up and the Globe and Mail and Maclean's had both contacted me and asked if I could write something about this going forward. So I do think there were people that were nervous about the economic side of this as early March, but and I know people in government were, because I was talking to people on my tweets and my columns that came out in the rest of that week. And Kevin and I had a number of conversations that week as well about policy stuff. And I know Kevin was asked by the federal government for his views, and I just threw mine onto the pages of the papers, and they knew what they were. But I think both of us were talking to governments that week. But I think there was a lot of confusion in that sort of March 10 to 20 period. Maybe I was just lucky to be writing a tweet when I was too late and should have been doing something else. But I certainly woke up to a flurry of activity that next morning.
Yeah, every day was important around that time in terms of changing people's perceptions. So, without getting into the CERB dispute, which we want to get to in a second between the two of you, overall, how do you assess the federal government's response to the federal government's economic response to what's happened in the economy, leaving aside the health response and the management of the pandemic? How are they doing? Granted that none of them would have there's no economic textbooks that prepare you for this. Nobody in the Department of Finance has been through anything like this before. Nobody anywhere in the world has been through anything like this before. So there's no guidebooks. So I presume we're all cutting people a fair bit of slack. Nonetheless, what did you see?
I think the right framework to think about this is, battlefield medicine, and you have to deal with the patients who need it most quickly first. And what we saw in the immediate time in mid-March was immediate steps in unprecedented coordination between the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance to solidify the banking sector and give assurances that the Bank of Canada and the Department of Finance would be there to back them, because those are things that can go wrong very, very quickly. And so they took that as a first and immediate step and went very big there. I mean, changed the bank regulations to allow banks to loan a lot more, tried to pump money through the Business Development Bank, and lowered the interest rate from the Bank of Canada. And so those are immediate moves that would happen very quickly and were really important to do first. After that, trying to put cash as quickly as possible into people's hands, people who needed it, that came down a lot to how quickly one could do it in terms of administration, what computer IT guy you have to reprogram the CRA computer fast enough, and lots of really normally boring, but at this time important, administrative details about what program can be done best. Overall, you saw, I think, in terms of the amounts, in terms of what they did first, and what they did second, and what they're doing now third, I think it made sense. There's lots of talk to be had about whether they got the individual elements right, but I think the order in which they addressed stuff was the right one.
You're a professor. Give them a grade.
I'm going to go with B+.
That's a pretty good mark. At least in my books it was. Got me through. That was good enough for law school. Ken, what do you think?
David, you've advised Department of Finance, and I've worked in Department of Finance, and I think there's two sides to this question. One is the policy development side of the equation, and the other is the administrative and implementation side of things. And I know some of the people, and I know Kevin does too. I know some of the people in the Federal Department of Finance, and I know a bunch of people across the country who I talked to someone from a Treasury board, one of the provincial Treasury boards, and they said, Ken, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've had 4 Treasury board meetings past midnight, and we're sitting in these Treasury board meetings trying to approve money and trying to figure out whether we got the policy mix right. So whether I agree with everything they've done, having been in the Department of Finance and having been in the government as you have or around them, I think the response from Canadian governments has been on the whole very, very strong on the policy side. And so far, because we haven't got all of the administration yet, so far I will admit that one of my concerns for my ideas was the administration and the ability of the government to administer a program like the CERB. The CERB administration, whether it was the right program or the wrong program, has been unbelievably strong, has been a remarkable thing. And so even though I don't share the same political stripe as in Ottawa, when you go through something like this, you got to take your partisan hat off and say they've done for what they were asked to do and what they've done. I would give them an A- just because I got to disagree with Kevin on something so far. On the administration side, now I'm going to hold judgment because I have some anxiety about the wage subsidy program and how that's going to roll up. But so far it's been very good.
Let me jump in on the administration side. Let me tell you a quick story. This is from Jerry Butts, the former principal secretary of the Prime Minister. And Jerry told this story in public, so I feel free to relate it now. When they won the election in 2015, they're having those initial meetings with Privy Council. Congratulations, Team Trudeau, you won the election. Here's the binders of stuff that we prepared of how to implement your platform. And in there was a binder about the Canada Child Benefit, which is one of their marquee policies, of taking the child benefit package and rearranging it. And they wanted to get it out the door in 2016. Congratulations, you won. Here's your binder of how to implement it. We have a plan that will take a number of years, but we're going to get that done for you. And, Team Trudeau said, thanks for the binder, but we want to do it by July 2016. And that's, 7 or 8 months from now. And the Privy Council guys are like, oh, I don't know. That sounds tough. Well, the end of the story is, the checks went out in July 2016. And the way I heard this story was, PMO guys giving high fives to each other because, we got this program done in 8 months. That was like a story they would tell over beers at a pub because they thought that was like, we really nailed that one. That was 8 months. They literally had like 8 days to get this done for the CERB. And so, what was a high five story in 2016, it's just a different order of magnitude of what they got done this time.
Let me just add a little piece to that because, I was involved in the campaign and we lost in 15 and the government moved on. But working with me in the war room is a guy named Sean Spear. And Sean Spear had been part of Department of Finance and part of PMO when Harper kept adjusting these benefits. And I remember sitting down with Sean the day after the election, and Sean said, "Oh my goodness, these guys hope to get this thing done quickly." And I know Sean called the PMO and offered his insights of what had worked when the Harper guys. So again, we fight each other aggressively in a campaign, but there really was, I think Sean might have even written something about this, there really was a concern across partisan lines on the administration of government. And Sean thought, he thought he needed to offer some advice on what had worked for the Harper guys as they redesigned these child benefits, and the Trudeau guys were going to do it. And I think so. I was an example of cooperation, but I think again, it highlights what Kevin is saying, that Sean thought, "Oh my goodness, they want to get this done in 7 months. It took us a long time to get these things designed." And to see that's why I'm giving the government such high kudos, is because they've done this so quickly.
Well, Scott, Reid, and I on this podcast spent a couple of weeks bitching about how long it took them to get the wage subsidy out. Because we were worried. I mean, it obviously happened given our whole conversation, it's ironic because it obviously happened at lightning speed, but yet we were worried that it was too late, in the sense that the companies would have already done the layoffs and wouldn't hire back. Leaving aside the time, how do you think this wage subsidy is going to work? And are companies actually hiring people back? And as a related question, what is the impact from unemployment going forward going to be from whatever lessons business will have learned through this about how few employees they can get away with?
Let me start I'm going to start at the front end of your question here, because again, I was sharing those early podcasts. I was nodding vigorously, and Scott and I had some Twitter exchanges, and Scott was one of the people, saying positive things about my idea. And this is precisely what I was worried about in the early days, which is why I proposed that the government just take the full list of people that had paid income taxes in 2018, send them a $2,000 check, and then tax back people that didn't need or didn't deserve it later on in the year. And a big part of my argument is the design of figuring out who needs it was going to be complicated, and then the time to do an application-based program was going to take some time. And so for both of those reasons and a couple of other ones, I propose that the government just take the full list of people that paid taxes in 2018, send them a check, and then we'll reconcile at the back end, because I was anxious about how fast things had to get out the door. And so I shared your and Scott and even Jenni's as well concern about these early days. Like I said, in retrospect, it's amazing the government got it done as quick as they did. Whether mine would have been a week or two quicker, I think is a question Kevin and I could probably dance on the head of a pin for a couple hours on. But there was a big motivation early on for me to propose what I did. Now sending checks to everyone on that paid taxes in 2018 does something else, because I think the biggest drop and the biggest economic loss here is people earning wage income who lost wage income. It's not people on social assistance, because government programs are going to continue working. It's not people on other government programs, disability programs, because those programs all kept working. What happened is people stopped working. And so I have been arguing that if they would have sent checks to everyone that paid taxes in 2018, it would have covered a vast majority of the people who earned wage income. And then the wage subsidy, which is now designing a program to go to employers instead of to people, arguably wouldn't have to be done. Now, there's all kinds of administrative challenges on my side of the argument here in terms of what employers do when their employees get $2,000. But I think that's my level of anxiety, is the government was extremely skillful. I won't say lucky. They were extremely skillful in getting the CERB, the payment to individuals out, but designing a payment to get to businesses. And we've seen a lot of back and forth with the CFIB and the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and the government saying, you miss these people. How are you going to design this? How are you going to make this all work? And I just think getting checks, a $2,000 check to Canadians across the board, I know Kevin's going to take issue with that, but people who filed income tax would have been a way to get a wage subsidy type thing out a lot faster than they did.
Yeah, why did I give a B+ grade? A lot of it comes down to the wage subsidy and thinking about how fast they're getting it into the hands of decision makers. And I'm fully cognizant of the policy and the administrative challenges that are there, that they prioritize getting the CERB out, the relief benefit to people, before the wage subsidy. And so now they're working hard on getting that portal up and going. So I think they made the right choice there in terms of where to allocate their scarce resources. But at the end of the day, look at what we're expecting firms to do. The portal is supposed to open by the end of April. Checks are going to be in business bank accounts in mid-May, early May. And so then they're going to be asking firms, imagine you have a medium-sized operation with 50 employees. You're going to say, okay, you're going to pull you off CERB in order to get a wage subsidy. It's going to last until June 15th. It won't be 1 month. I mean, I'm not sure that is something that a lot of firms are going to be doing. I think it's arriving a bit late in the game. And that is the way things have fallen down. And so I understand there's reasons for that. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure the take-up is going to be as great as they expected. And I think we're going to see some more people on CERB than on the wage subsidy. And we have seen some take-up, though. I mean, Air Canada and WestJet have announced they're going to be doing some higher backs, and there may be some other places that do as well. Furthermore, by the time we hit May, perhaps it may be announced that they may extend it a bit more beyond the June 15th that is now capped at. So there is some hope there that they can use that platform that they spent some time building to provide some support to the labor market going forward.
Those are firms.
Is there any concern about the issue I raised, that this will be a good opportunity for companies to take a look at how automation might make their businesses more efficient?
Yeah, I have a colleague named Henry Sue who's done research exactly on that over the past 20 years. So looking at the early 2000s recession and the recovery from the financial crisis, and he found exactly that when you had a recession, there was a big drop off, people get laid off, and then what tends to happen is firms use that as a time to rethink how they do things, and that's when they implement their technology changes, and so that's why the recovery from the Great Recession took 4 or 5 years in the labor market. And that wasn't the case for recessions back in the 70s and 80s. Things bounced back more quickly. So Henry's research suggests that the concern that you raised, David, is on the mark. And this is something that we may be seeing out there, which may be good for the long run of the economy, that we have more technology in place. But in the short run, that means that it may be a slower recovery than we'd like.
I worry about the medium-sized businesses, people with about 50 employees. And I have a couple of friends here, and I'm an economist, so anecdote isn't conclusive. But the time that it's taking them to get this wage subsidy, and the gap was supposed to be filled in with loans from the bank, the $40,000, of which $10,000 doesn't need to be repaid necessarily. But even that didn't get up onto the bank's websites until this past week. And what they were saying to me is, if I knew every one of my employees was going to get a $2,000 check, I could have just reduced my payroll for 2 weeks. But right now I have the decision, if I don't pay my employees, they can't buy food. If I lay them off, they go on CERB. But then if I can't pay any of my bills, I can't get back into business in a month and a half. And the wage subsidy will come at a point how do I restart everything again? And so the timing issue, and we haven't, we're in the middle of this right now. We don't know, but the timing issue, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing for a lot of medium-sized businesses with sort of 50 to 100 employees to deal with. I think really small businesses tend to have a bit more flexibility. They can say to their employees, "Hey, you go on $2,000 a month," and there's a lot more relationships between small businesses, between employees and employers, I think, and I think there's some flexibility there, not to understate, but it's those sort of 50 to 100, maybe 50 to 200 employee businesses that I really am concerned about coming back when this is over.
What is going to happen to all of this government debt? All this debt, period, because I presume the personal debt, which was a huge problem before this, is exploding throughout this. But I don't even understand what the rules around government debt are going to be anymore. If any one country had got itself into the situation that every country is now in, under the rules I knew, that country would be forced into severe austerity and be forced to prioritize getting its balance sheet in order before the IMF or anybody else would come to its aid. I don't believe that's what's going to happen now. I don't believe we're going into a period of hard austerity because I don't think the economy will be able to withstand that. So that just means we've got to me, you guys must know the answer to this. Are we going to start treating these government debts in a different way, or What's going to happen?
Yeah, let me jump in on that first. The biggest difference is the fact that interest rates are zero. And what we faced in the 90s, back when you were in the hot seat, David, was interest rates in the high single digits. And just the math of exponential growth, as we all know with viruses, is pretty painful. And the same thing is true with debts and deficit. When you're doing with 9% interest rates, it's a very different story than 0% interest rates. That's point one. Point two is, from that time in the mid 90s, lots of credit to Finance Minister Paul Martin and Prime Minister Paul Martin and Prime Minister Stephen Harper and Finance Minister Jim Flaherty. Everyone there over the past 20 years, from 95 to 2015, did a fantastic job of pulling our federal debt down to a sustainable level. Now, from that point in 2015, we've had vigorous debates about deficit policy and whether we ought to run a small deficit or a zero deficit. But the point is that we didn't get any worse in terms of our debt to GDP ratio over the past 5 years. We kind of held it constant, and we can have a debate about whether that was the right policy. But because of the work done by previous liberal and conservative governments, that allowed us to enter this crisis with a lot of borrowing room. And honestly, we are now going to be using it. Over the next year, we're going to see deficits of a magnitude that we have never even considered before. And we're going to be able to get through that. Now, that depends on being able to get back on a trajectory that makes sense when we hit 2021-22. But over the next year, it's going to be deficit palooza.
I'm gonna come at this question by telling a little story. I was on the phone the other day with my friend Paul Booth, and Paul Booth was the Deputy Minister of Industry during the financial crisis, and was tasked by Stephen Harper with quarterbacking Stephen Harper and the senior public service, quarterbacking the government's response to the auto industry. And I was working with the auto parts manufacturers at the time. And Paul reminded me that in 2008, 2009, one of the directives that Stephen Harper and the officials gave to everybody as they were designing this policy and designing other policies around the 2008, 2009 financial crisis was that if they had a choice between 2 or 3 different policies, they should choose the one that's the most easy to unwind. Choose the policy that we can do for 2 or 3 months and then stop. And Canada, and I've written something about this, mostly in glowing terms about Stephen Harper, who I worked for many years. But Canada really did, especially if you compare Canada to the United States and Canada to some European countries, coming out of the financial crisis, Stephen Harper and the policies they put in place, they unwound very quickly. They did some temporary infrastructure programs. The auto bailout was paid back within a number of years, and so I think if you move forward to today. I think not the programs they've announced so far are going to be easy to unwind for the very simple reason that we can't afford to have the level of subsidy for people and business that we're putting going forward. But I think the next round of policies, the next round of policy decisions the government's going to have to make on what I call pushing play as opposed to pushing pause, they're going to have to, I think it's going to be very important that they think very carefully about how they design policies that are easy to unwind down the road, as I think Stephen Harper did. And it's the reason Stephen Harper got back to balance by 2015. There's some dispute between Liberals and Conservatives about the exact numbers, but basically he got back to balance by 2015 because the policies he put in place. So I think that's for the next round, and we've started already some of the policies for the oil and gas industry. The policy for the oil and gas industry, David, you and I are from Western Canada. It's great policy, but there's orphan wells. This 1.7 billion or whatever they're spending is not going to cover all of the orphan wells. So are they going to continue to pay for these, and how long does that last? And where does, so I think those are the kind of really important questions that I hope the federal government talks and thinks about in the next few weeks.
Yeah, but one way to think about that is, over the past few weeks, the main criticism of the federal government has been, you Liberals aren't spending money fast enough. Can you please spend it faster? And I don't think that's going to be the criticism, 8 months from now. And furthermore, the pressure on them is going to be from the other side. And so it's going to be a different world in terms of the political pressures on them to figure out a sustainable way forward for our public finances.
Yeah, faster is good, but longer is bad. Right?
Clark said getting money to send some kind of signal to Scott Clark said you need to send some kind of signal that you were going to get your fiscal house back in order. What might a signal be?
I don't think we're ready for that yet. I think it's too early. You know, Jason Kenney shoveling out the money out the door as fast as the NDP next door. And they're not, not incredibly dissimilar in how they're doing that. I think that's a question for June, July, August. I mean, I personally would like to see some commitments to these kind of things earlier than later.
In fairness, he would have meant that as well, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
So I do think if they were going to give a signal now, I think the signal that I talked about would be a good one, is that, we're putting this policy in place to help X industry, and it has a sunset clause, or it's not going to come back. Let me give you a specific example. If you said to the airline industry, we're gonna put a program in place to pay somehow the difference between where you are today and where you are before the COVID-19 hit, and 6 months after COVID, we're still only at 60 or 70% of pre-COVID. Does that mean we're going to keep subsidizing the last 30% forever? And again, those are the kind of signals I'm going to be looking for, is, are they putting policies in place that have long tails on them? And I think that will signal a potential problem.
Okay, so the last backward-looking thing I want you to talk about is the discussion you were having on Twitter about the CERB, the Employment Replacement Fund. Income replacement fund, and of $2,000 a month. And as I understand it, to shorthand its position, Ken, you think it should have been essentially a basic income, a crisis basic income that went out to everybody. And Kevin, you are more comfortable with the targeted approach of the CERB. But as I watched the CERB, after they unveiled it, every time somebody stuck up their hand and said, but it doesn't give any money to me, they would say, okay, money covers you too. So at the end of the day, how is it different from a basic income?
Sure, it's different in a few ways. And I agree with your characterization that they've been expanding the eligibility a lot, but even with that, we're still at around 7 million people, and that might creep up a bit more. But there's 30 million adults in Canada. There's still 23 million who didn't get it. So if we measure it that way, we still are, less than a quarter of the population. So if you were to make it universal, you'd be multiplying the expense by a factor of 4. And you're worried about debt and deficit there a minute ago. You would see it change substantially if you did that. So a couple things about this. So, Ken has very ably been an advocate for doing this, but there's a couple of key elements of fantasy in Ken's plan. And one is that this would have been any faster to do it through the 2018 tax filer list or something. What we saw with the CERB, it got out there fairly fast. We don't have the commissioner of the CRA here, but I have been told, and CRA people have testified at finance, that it would have been no faster. There's no button to press just to send money out to everyone. There's no such button. It would have been reprogramming computers. It would have been some time. So that's point one of fantasy. Point two is that, that it would go out to everyone. The best we could possibly do would be the 2018 tax filer list. And the thing about that is there are people who have died. They're on that list. There are people who have moved. And, that list is incomplete. And people have moved their addresses, and people who didn't even file. So there are a lot of missing parts of that. There are certainly missing parts on the CERB benefit as well. But the idea that sending checks to everyone was easy is simply not true. And the last point I'd make is on Ken's idea that you send the money out now and then we'll figure out how to fix it and claw it back on the tax form next year. And the problem with that is that it's just really hard to do that, because imagine you're going to send out these checks and then from someone making $50,000 or $70,000, tell them, a year from now, hey, you got to pay back $8,000 and cut a check to Receiver General for $8,000. Would you please do that? That's a pretty tough ask for middle income earners to make. And if you don't ask middle income earners to pay it back, the ones who didn't quote unquote need it, then you're going to end up spending oodles of money, because, if you're only going to claw it back from the top 10%, then you're still paying 90% of it. So it's really, really expensive. There's no faster way to do it. And the list was incomplete. And we'd be still back in this world of trying to plug holes as we are with the CERB.
All right, that gives me a list. So on fantasy, I don't think the jury's
which is
in
normally
yet.
Scott Reid's department on this podcast, by the way.
Yes. So on fantasy, I don't think the jury's in yet, because I thought the crisis basic income could also function as an indirect wage subsidy. So we have to see how well the wage subsidy flows out. And so I think if the crisis basic income could have functioned also as a wage subsidy, in other words, employers could look at their employees and say, we know that you all got $2,000, so we're going to reduce collective wages on average in this firm by $1,500 to $2,000, and that's how we're going to stay afloat. I think that would have been a better way to accomplish the wage subsidy. On the gaps, so there's 30,000 Canadians, there's 23,000 filers. Sorry, 30 million Canadians, 23 million tax filers, but there's 16 to 19, depending on whether you count the unemployed, in the labor force. And if you're in the labor force and you're working, that's a vast majority of the filers would catch that. And so if you're working, you're almost certainly, or most people that are working are filing income tax. And those are the people we're trying to get money to. So sure, there are people who wouldn't be captured by the tax filing thing. And we probably would have had to have set something up, a supplementary thing like this, but we would have had time to do it, because the vast majority of people that would have needed the money would have got it. And the final thing that I would say is, in terms of reconciling it next year, I think we're going to be talking about for a little while about how to boost the economy and how to get money into the economy. And we're doing it through monetary policy by loosening the spigots and lowering interest rates. But I think this could have also been something could have boosted the economy. And if we look at all the other things that are happening, I mean, so we're going to need to do some targeted stuff, but this would have been a great way to boost the economy. And we could have figured out the tax back in the fall. The final thing that I would say is, when I first proposed this, and I've become stronger on this as this thing looks like it might drag out for a while, I think the crisis basic income could have carried us through the first month or two. And that would have given time to develop a wage subsidy that was needed. It would have given us time to develop more targeted programs. It would have given us time to do these other things. So I think a couple of months of wage subsidy could have given the officials time to develop. And so I mean, my biggest point is, let's see how the wage subsidy goes. I really do hope it goes well. I really do hope it gets to the people that need it. But if it doesn't, and if it falls apart, a crisis basic income could have performed a large part of that function and gotten to people at about the time the CERB did, which was a lot earlier than they're getting the wage subsidy.
Yeah, the wage subsidy, I share some concerns, as I said before, about how quickly that's going to be out and how effective it's going to be. But in terms of the magnitude of a crisis basic income with 30 million adults at $2,000 a month, the math on that, if you look at all the zeros, is $60 billion a month. Our GDP pre-crisis was about $200 billion a month. So you're looking at 30% of GDP going just to that one thing before you bail out big business, before you bail out small business, before you do anything else. That's just a big load of money, and maybe I'm someone who likes to spend a lot of money on public programs, but 30% of GDP on one program.
How much of that would you get back from the tax system? How much of that would you get back from the tax system?
Depends
if you make it taxable, you get some of it back, sure. But the thing is, like I said, if you tried to claw it all back in the tax system on the back end, the problem there is that in order to get a lot of that 60 billion back, you would have to go really far down the income distributions, because the median tax filer's income is only $35,000. So if you say everyone over $35,000 and up, or and down, $35,000 and down, you get to keep your whole CBI, your whole crisis basic income, $35,000 and down, you're still going to be spending $15 billion a month on this thing. So you're only going to get back $15 billion from clawing back at $35,000. Now, again, good luck going to someone who's making $40,000 and telling them they have to pay it all back. So as that threshold climbs up, when you get up to saying, okay, maybe only $100,000 have to pay back, then it's only 10% of the $60 billion you're going to get back. You're still going to be paying out $54 billion a month in this thing. So that's the challenge, that if you're only going to claw it back from the really high earners, then you end up with a really, really big bill for what you're paying out.
Just quickly, David, I think you wouldn't do a lot of the other policies if you had this, as I have been saying a couple times. And also, I think I'd do it on family income, and I think you could do on family income would make it a little bit easier to claw some of this back. But that's my response to that.
So, gentlemen, you both agree on something, which is that an unfortunate byproduct of this debate from your perspective has been people saying, holy Christ, Ken Bosanquist is for a guaranteed annual income. This is the best thing I've ever heard. Obviously, there is a complete 100% consensus now in Canada that we ought to have a universal basic income or a guaranteed annual income, whatever you want to call it. And that is not where either of your heads are at all. And you have been angrily explicit about this on Twitter, Ken. But I don't really understand. Like, I need you two to walk me through why this hasn't been a perfect exemplar and really shown us what kind of cracks and fissures exist in our social safety net and how many more people are vulnerable than used to be vulnerable. Because even if they're making good livings, that living is contingent upon a lot of things they don't control. It's not a steady job, those kinds of things. So, I mean, well before this happened, I was becoming convinced that basic income was an idea whose time had come. I was enthusiastic about the Ontario pilots. And just last week, I had Danielle Martin on the show, and Danielle Martin said, having been through this, if I could improve the healthcare system in any way, and she's written a book which has a million ideas about how to improve healthcare, she said the most important thing I would do would be a basic income, because nothing that we do in the health system is more determinative of health outcomes than income. So, having said all that, what's wrong with a basic income?
So I'm going to take this one first because it's been my thing. Let me start by just saying a universal basic income is a terrible idea. So I'm going to leave it to Kevin to talk about the financial aspects of it, because everything I would say about it, I quote his great CD Howe piece on this. But let me talk about two other aspects of it. And I think the first one is the most important. Poverty and low income is a multifaceted problem. And the reason people have low income and the reason people are in poverty is very different. And so having a single universal program to address poverty when the reasons people are in poverty are so different makes no sense. We have an unemployment insurance system for people that can become unemployed. We have a welfare system for people who have very low income over a moderate period of time. We have disability programs.
Let me stop you. We don't have an unemployment insurance system in Canada. We do not have an unemployment insurance system in Canada. Maybe a third of workers have an unemployment insurance system?
2/3, 60% are covered by the unemployment insurance system. So I take your point that what this crisis has done is identified some gaps, and Kevin and I think have both talked about that. You know, one of the outcomes of this is we're going to have a light shone on people who are missing. So I think there's some fixes to unemployment insurance we could do, but that doesn't mean we should replace unemployment insurance with a basic income, or we should replace welfare with a basic income, or we should replace disability programs with a low income. We should replace assured income for severely handicapped in Alberta with a basic income. So I think my biggest reason for not wanting to do a basic income in normal times is that the reason for poverty is very low. My second reason is we put conditions on the receipt of basic income on people who are on unemployment insurance and many people who are on welfare. So in Ontario Works, you need to have a program to get back to work, especially if you're an able-bodied and younger. And those conditions are good because work is good. We should want our programs to foster and encourage and help and assist people who are on social assistance of whatever kind getting back to work. A universal basic income, if that's all you have for these poor people, doesn't do that. And I think that's a fundamental flaw because society, as John Carchen used to say, the best social program is a job. So our programs should be designed to get people back to work, and a flaw of universal basic income doesn't do that. I've got 6 more, but I'll leave it there and let Kevin talk about affordability or whatever else he wants to talk about.
I take a drink every time Krejci gets mentioned on the podcast.
I hope that's light beer.
So I one agree and one disagree with David's framing of this. One is I think this has highlighted how our unemployment insurance system, our employment insurance system, really needs not just some fixes, as Ken said, but bottom up rethink of what we're doing here to match the needs of today's economy. Where in tomorrow's economy, as we get on the other side of this thing, today's economy is a mess. We don't want to do, we want to match the future needs of the economy, and it's not there now. The people who are not covered, the gig workers, the part-time workers, the people who have take a wage cut and need something to smooth them over. There's lots of things that we could be doing that we're not doing. So that I totally agree with. The idea that, and so there are principles from basic income research that are useful here. Principles like, smoothing out transitions of benefits and giving people temporary cash so they can spend it on things they might need when they're in a position of need. But where I differ with the basic income folks is on the idea that we want to give stuff out in a universal way without looking at targeting to people who need it. And let me give an example of autism funding in Ontario. So what it used to be in Ontario was there was a needs-based assessment. If your kid was on the one part of the spectrum, you get more money. On the lower part of the spectrum, you get less money. And that was replaced in, Plan 1 of the Ford government on this file, as we'll all remember, generated protests and such, with a flat check to all parents with autism. And what happened was some parents who needed $25,000 a year in therapy now got this flat check. Other parents who just needed a bit of extra help got the same flat check. And so what that shows is that, needs-based assessments and needs-based benefits are not a bad thing. Thinking back to social assistance and how it's done in every province, but also Ontario, in every province that I'm aware of, the disability stream actually has more clients than the regular stream. So Ontario Works versus Ontario Disability Benefits. There's more on the disability side. So when you think about that, the people on the disability, they get a bigger amount, but they also get the supports. So like the wheelchairs and the other kind of supports that they might need. What you do, if you wipe away all social assistance spending and just hand out a check to everyone, is essentially you're privatizing all of that insurance that we're giving. Instead of giving you a wheelchair if you need it, we're saying, here's a check, buy your own damn wheelchair. And I just don't think that's a good way to organize our social safety net. Our social safety net ought to be there depending on your need, not just
You're describing something, Kevin, that everyone. You were describing something, though, that is far more robust than actually exists. Welfare is a joke in this country. You can't live on welfare. That is designed not to be used. That program is designed not to be used. It has been, I'll take the shit on this, ever since the funding for the Canada Assistance Plan was cut in the 95 budget. Nobody's funded welfare in this country anymore. And that's point number one. Point number two, we've just talked about the unemployment insurance system does not even acknowledge the existence of the gig economy. It's trapped in 1970s and 80s design and construction. So you're talking about, well, we can't get rid of all these great supports we have for people in order to put this basic income in place. We don't have great supports for people.
Yeah, where I would agree with Dr. Daniel Martin and with you on that is, the research is very clear that getting more income and more supports and more benefits to people who are struggling, the benefits to them and to their kids and to the future of the economy are huge. And so that I have absolutely no disagreement with. Where my challenge to the basic income as the way to get there is, again, by not targeting, you are spreading the peanut butter too thin across the toast, and people who do not need it are going to get it. And that money could be better used than people who are actually struggling. I want check to go to the kid who needs the wheelchair so he can go to school and learn and be a good citizen and a good taxpayer. I don't want a check. And so the problem, especially with the more universal ways of doing the basic income, is that I get a check rather than the person who needs it. Acknowledging that means testing and needs assessments can be a big barrier and they can be done poorly, and we ought to pay a lot of attention to doing those things humanely. But the cost of not doing it is you end up writing a bunch of checks to people who don't need it. And so that's a balance we have to find.
I did a study, Ralph Klein changed welfare from 93 to 96, and I wrote something about this back in the stone ages of the late 1990s. And what he did was change how difficult it was for people to get welfare who were able-bodied. And I don't have time to go into the whole study, but the bottom line is they changed the orientation of the program to get people who could work to work. And I think if a universal basic income, and I said this earlier, if universal basic income in any way impairs the current programs that we have to encourage or push or even nudge or even push people into work, then I think that's a net bad thing. I mean, the goal of our public policy can't just be to get people enough income to live. There has to be a serious balance with getting people back to work, because working is good on its own merits. It is a positive for the individual. It's a positive for society. It's a positive for their family. And I think part of what you call, David, stingy or can't live on, part of the reason for some of that is we want to encourage people to do whatever they can to take a low wage job, because even working the lowest wage job has benefits for the people and the families who get it.
Yeah, well, where I go different is I don't want there to be low wage jobs. I want there to be good jobs, and I want those kids who are in those struggling families to have a good start. And that's why I love the Canada Child Benefit, getting money in the hands of people who need it and phasing it out for people who don't. And I think that is the right approach. And what we want is a high wage economy, and not encouraging the horrible choice between shitty benefits and a shitty job. We can do better than that, and we should aspire to it.
Yeah, I'll just put a plug in for wage subsidies. Go.
Gentlemen, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to look ahead. And I want you to try to look into your crystal balls and think of, my parents got married during the Great Depression in Saskatchewan in the dirty 30s. And I know that generation of people very well. And they came out of that decade different than they went into it. And there were a set of values and beliefs about life that endured as long as those people were on this planet. They were going to be frugal, for example. They weren't going to. So I'm interested in what enduring changes emerged from this. But I want to start by reading you a passage from a piece that Mark Carney, for those of you who don't know, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and just recently stepped down as governor of the Bank of England, wrote a piece in The Economist. And here's a passage from that piece. This points to a final, deeper issue. As the philosopher Michael Sandel has argued, in recent decades, subtly but relentlessly, we have been moving from a market economy to a market society. Increasingly, to be valued, an asset or activity has to be in a market. For example, Amazon is one of the world's most valuable companies, yet the Amazon region appears on no ledger until it is stripped of its foliage and converted to farmland. The price of everything is becoming the value of everything. This crisis could help reverse that relationship so that public values help shape private value. When pushed, societies have prioritized health first and foremost, and then looked to deal with the economic consequences. In this crisis, we know we need to act as an interdependent community, not independent individuals. So the values of economic dynamism and efficiency have been joined by those of solidarity, fairness, responsibility, and compassion. By the way, you have a reaction to that?
He missed
What's
one,
that?
Which is the family. The family is the core bedrock of society. And I think government policy, and there's a lot of non-monetary production and consumption and other things that happen within the family. And I'm not saying this is something the start of the question and where I'm going is not necessarily linked. But if I were to say what would I like to come out of this, we're spending more times with our family. That's sometimes going to be good and sometimes going to be difficult for some people depending on their circumstances. But there's a lot of families who are spending more time together. And I hope that when we come out of this, we recognize that the value of our families and the value of our families in our communities and the value of our families in society is something that's incredibly important, whether it's valued economically or not. And so like the child benefit, for example, was one of the biggest new social programs in the last 20 years, introduced by Stephen Harper, enhanced by Justin Trudeau, has put a lot of money into the hands of families with children. And I don't think that was done just for economic reasons, or just because of the things Mark Carney's talking about. Having been the person who helped design those for Stephen Harper, I can tell you that the family as the bedrock of society was one of the motivations for doing that, and the family as a place of non-monetary production and consumption was a motivation for doing that. So I don't think, I understand where Mark Carney's coming from, but I think it misses a really important building block to society, which is the family.
Yeah, I agree with Ken. Families are great. Got one of my own. I really love them all. Big fan of the family here. But what happens when your whole family gets sick? What happens when your family's main source of income goes away? We need more than the family, and that's our society. That's our governments having our back when we hit a big crisis. And I think where I see coming out of this what I think will be a permanent change is that the memory of the government being there, whether it's with our health system when your granny got sick, or when it's with your CERB check when you needed it most, that government was there for you, and that can be relied upon in times of great need. And so the fact that we should and we can rely on government to work together with us to support our families when we need it is something that can have, I think, a permanent change going forward. Just to give one example of that, when we think about a conversation we may have a few months from now about changing unemployment insurance, that conversation is going to be had within the context of 7 million Canadians remembering what it felt like to get a CERB check when promised on time and enough to pay their rent or their food bills. And that's going to be something, it's not like, oh, those guys in the Atlantic or those guys in rural whatever who got unemployment checks. No, this is me. And there's going to be people who have a very personal experience with receiving this now. And I think that's going to change that conversation going forward.
Everything
Kevin, you've done work in the past on inequality, right? And one of the things that everybody seems to be remarking on in this thing is that the people that were designated as essential workers tended to be among the lower paid people in our society. Do you think there's any chance any of that changes? Do you think that we've recognized that a lot of these people that we're paying the least amount of money we can possibly pay to are doing pretty important things?
I think that is a very interesting thing we've all seen when we go to the store. I mean, I've thanked the clerks in stores a lot more than I used to, I can say, over the past few weeks. I think that will change when we get into discussions of worker protections about, sick leave and ability to refuse safe work. Those are discussions we're going to have. When we get into thinking of the people who work in care homes and the safety requirements, the pay, the conditions that they work under, those conversations are going to be had under a very different circumstance. And to hit close to home for Ken there in Alberta, the government of Alberta was elected with a mandate to wrestle their deficit to the ground, in part by wrestling with the healthcare workers who were paid more than other parts of the country. And, if that is going to be their goal as a path to balancing their budget in Alberta or any province, good luck taking on the nurses union. I mean, that's not going to be an easy public conversation. Like, hey, nurses, thanks for saving all the lives. Now take a pay cut. That's going to be a tough conversation going forward, and for good reasons, because this has made very relevant to many of us those services, whether it's nurses, whether it's clerks in stores, or whether it's the guy who's doing manual labor out there in the danger of the virus. We have a lot more respect for them now than we used to, and I think that's awoken a lot of us to that value.
So we're only a third of the way through the spending.
Pay increases for these people?
We're only a third. Let me come there indirectly. We're only a third of the way through this. I mean, the CERB got, as we've been saying, got a lot of the people, but now we've got the wage subsidy. And so I think while Kevin is right that so far the government has done a great job, there still could be some failures ahead. And if that happens, we could have a different kind of backlash. I wrote a short piece with a good friend of mine, Dan Robertson, that also said that if a mass majority of this money ends up in the hands of bigger or big business, and the public doesn't feel like they were deserving of it, or they took advantage of it, or somehow did something like that, there could be a populist backlash fomented.
That's
there.
why this is a very bad day for Ruth's Chris Steakhouse. This is a very bad day for exactly that reason, for Ruth's Chris Steakhouse, right? Who took out a big loan. Yeah. Go ahead.
So I think I don't think we're at the end of the all government is good. I was saying there are certainly workers through this thing that are incredibly valuable that aren't getting paid much, and the people in the grocery stores and some of the other folks are in that list. No one I know thinks doctors are the lowest paid people in society, and I've got some nurses in the family, and they've done pretty well, and their pensions are incredibly strong, right? And Kevin and I have talked about this before, but there's also going to be a divide between the public sector and the private sector. I think there's another interesting divide, and if this wage subsidy thing doesn't work, there's going to be a lot of people in the private sector looking at the people working in the public sector, and those are nurses, doctors, university professors, Kevin, and a lot of public sector workers who were fine, quote unquote, mostly fine through this whole thing and still have their pension. And if a lot of businesses fail, small, big, and medium, there's going to be a divide, and an interesting divide there. So that's not a they're doing everything wrong statement. It's just, I hope the wage subsidy thing works. I hope people get back to the jobs that they had before when this is over. I really hope all of those things happen, but there's risks there.
Gentlemen, I wish we could continue on for another hour. This has been so fabulous, and my hope would be that you would come back on maybe as this thing progresses and check in with us about how things are unfolding. I think there's been super informative conversation for our listeners, and I really want to thank you both for taking the time to do it. And unlike our promotion, you got along just splendidly. Everybody out there listening, stay tuned for the political panel with Jenni and Scott coming right up to see what they thought of our Economist panel and viewer mailbag, listener mailbag, whatever we're calling it. Thanks. Take care. Bye. All right, Herle Burlyites, we're back with the panel. Jenni Byrne and Scott Reid are here. We're going to do a listener viewer mailbag today. But first, I'm going to check in with how they're doing. We haven't heard from, actually, you know what? I need a word from our sponsor. So let me just take a step back and say that if we've learned anything in these past few weeks, it's that governments matter. And if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's going on at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start that day already ahead of the game. During a crisis, the importance of governments increases dramatically. The only way you can really get the detailed, on-the-ground coverage that you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. If you want a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. All right, sorry for the false start. We're back with the panel. Jenni, Scott. Jenni, we've been doing this quarantine thing forever. How are you doing?
I'm going to say what I say every week. I am so done with this. I'm done.
But you're fancy. Look at you. You've got lace and lipstick. Well, my God. I think, is Cary Grant going to knock on the door and keep you dancing?
For you guys, I put some lipstick on. I have like a shirt on. It's like a business on top, but like a party underneath because I've still got my pajama bottoms on.
Scott, what are you wearing below the camera?
Oh, let me tell you, you're going to have to work harder to find out, buddy. But I've got my skeleton dog and boy T-shirt on, which is really, quite a metaphorical statement on my attitude about life these days. I'm doing okay. Today is the 21st of April when we're recording this. It's the 1-year anniversary of what my 6-year-old calls Crackface Day. 1 year ago today, he drove his bicycle into a schoolyard wall, blew his head up like a balloon, was in sick kids for 4 or 5 days, and he literally broke his forehead, like smashed his forehead in half, and he blew up. And so we're looking at old pictures today of Crack Face Day, as Sam likes to call it, and thinking to ourselves, it's shitty to be stuck inside your house, but it's a lot better than we were 1 year ago today. So I'm feeling content.
Context is everything. I love this story. When Saskatchewan turned 100, they did a book of all the people in the province who were 100 years old. And they asked them questions about their lives. And this one woman, they said, what was the worst moment of your life? And she said, when my daughter got her head stuck in the milk jug. And then the next question was, what was the best moment of your life? And she said, when I got my daughter's head out of the milk jug.
The wheel turned a little slower.
100 years. She lived 100 years, and everything that important happened to her within 1 minute of her life.
Oh.
All right, you folks had the opportunity to listen to the chat I had with Ken Bosencool and Kevin Milligan. Pretty interesting. Lots of stuff on the table. Either of you have any reaction to what you heard?
I had one thought, and there was lots of interesting stuff there, and I've been going back and forth with Ken in particular while this was unfolding around the need for wage subsidy and his proposal. But I was interested in what they had to say about going forward, and I was interested in particular about the fact that both of them agreed that a universal basic income going forward is a bad idea. And I'm not sure they're wrong, but I want to take a run at one thing in particular. They both highlighted how they fear that a universal basic income will lead to a diminution of the value of work. And that without the incentive to work, without trying to say to people, you only get this benefit as long as you're looking for work, it's about getting you back to work. We must. To me, I appreciate that value very greatly. I get the value of work, but I think that's a testable thesis. And I think in most places where they've had pilots on universal income, they've found that has not actually happened. That it hasn't increased the ranks of those who say, I think I'll lay around all day and, pick my ass and smoke weed. And so I go back to what Wynne was doing. I like the idea of a pilot so that you see in more normal times what the behavioral impacts are. Because if that's Lauder's objection, the behavioral impact, I'm not sure that the assumption that's being made is a valid one. It may be valid, and if it is, then it's a problem. But it's something that ought to be tested before we just say, well, if you give people the option not to work, they don't. In my experience, people strive to work. And I think coming out of this, people are going to particularly strive to work. They're going to assign particular and unique and renewed value on that.
Jenni, how do you feel about basic income?
I'm not generally a supporter of it for the reasons that Ken and Kevin laid out. I'm not particularly, in terms of this case, I'm kind of a little torn on it. I think if for Ken's position on basic income for people, if the government wanted to do that, they would have had to have done it kind of a month and a half ago. If they were going to give every Canadian $2,000 as opposed to the CERB benefit, I just think it's too late for that. So I kind of see merit in all of their arguments, but I think in terms of if for a COVID argument, like not Scott, what you're saying in terms of a pilot for like moving forward, in terms of like our COVID world, I think if that was going to happen, it would have had to have happened a month and a half ago when like the Americans did it, for example.
I'll just last word on this. I think we'll find that we're going to have to improvise a form of it going forward. Not like the income tax will stay with us forever out of a crisis, but I think as we try to stage our way out of it, it will be, I grudgingly acknowledge in the way that the Trump guys have identified, it'll be a phased recovery and reopening of the economy whenever that happens. And I think we'll find that we'll need Ken's idea or a variation on Ken's idea or a variation on the CERB for portions of the economy, because those folks won't come back. And so I think we'll find that it will be rolled back for many, but not all, for a period of time at least.
What I took away from it that I was encouraged by on that segment of the conversation was that both of those guys, both of whom are on the small c conservative side of the spectrum, both agreed that we need a more robust social safety net than we have, and that employment insurance and welfare combined are not doing the job, and that this crisis has completely illustrated that those programs are not doing the job that they're allegedly supposed to be doing. So if that kind of consensus exists around putting together a more robust social safety net in whatever form that takes, I'll be pleased. So, viewer mailbag. Woo! Listen, maybe it should be called listener mailbag because most people listen to us, but I'd like to navigate people to YouTube, so I'm calling it viewer mailbag. Let's start with a guy named Brandon Tazo, who's a political science professor. So every time he asks us a question, I feel like he's pranking us. But he says, does money matter in politics? Has it made or broken a campaign? Does it sway politicians in decision-making, or is it one among a number of other factors? I've got some thoughts on this, but Jenni, maybe I'll let you go first.
Well, I think money absolutely matters in terms of running a campaign. I don't think it matters in terms of decision-making. I think our system of politics is much different than other systems in the U.S. But I think it definitely matters. Ask the NDP campaign in the last election whether they would have liked more money leading into the last couple weeks. So being able to raise money, I think, is extremely important for to be able to run effective campaigns. There are examples where it can be organic, but we all know, having worked on countless ones, those are really few and far between.
Hey, can I ask you a question? In 2011, when the NDP were surging and we were dying, if they'd had the money to go toe-to-toe with you through the stretch run, how might it have been different?
I don't think in 2011 it would have been. I don't think it would have been different. I still think they would have taken. You guys got 34 seats that campaign. I think they would have taken more seats. Still taken more seats from you. Like, we fight the NDP in so little, in so few ridings. So, some in Northern Ontario, some in BC, some in Saskatchewan. But for the most part, NDP, like, who their main opponent is, are you guys. Like, you guys are going head to head. So you guys.
No, I know, but
if they had more money, I think it would have been more detrimental for Ignatio's campaign.
Right. Okay, Scott, what do you think? Money in politics.
I don't know how anything could have been more detrimental for Ignatio's campaign. What, like a rock rolling and falling on him, a giant dinosaur foot coming out of the sky and crushing him? I mean, Christ, got 11 seats. What the fuck else goes? I mean, it's I guess, I think I have a pretty conventional view on this, which is that money opens up opportunities and it opens up strategic possibilities for you in a campaign. But it's not like the United States where it can be a substitute for a strategy. Like, obviously, Bloomberg didn't win, so, that's one high-profile case. But the reality is that there's tons of congressional races. There are tons of down ballot races in the United States where you can have a shit candidate, you can have a shit set of circumstances, and if you can buy enough media and buy enough resources, you can just power that through to a win. I don't think that happens in Canada, but what I do think is that if you have money, then you can contemplate certain kinds of strategies. And if you're smart and you deploy those resources appropriately, it'll be a difference maker in terms of seat total and results. And correspondingly, therefore, if you don't have money, some of those opportunities won't be available. So as an example, in 2011, just to pick up that, there were things that the NDP had not structured their campaign to do, because planning at the outset, they never dreamed that they'd be in the position they were with 10 days to go. And so even then, if you had some resources coming in because there was a bit of a groundswell of organic fundraising, it was hard to sort of suddenly pinwheel and put those things into place. So I think money matters. It probably matters less than people think because they're so heavily influenced by their perspective on the United States and politics. But I don't think money matters. It's not determinative in Canada, and I think by and large that's a good thing. One last point: it could have been a lot more important. The Greys Keystone was always, and it was relatively unexploited until we did it in 2004 for the first time, was pre-writ spending. And if pre-writ spending hadn't been largely shut down with reforms that were put in place in the last term, then that's a place where a real difference maker could have happened. And that's something that really severely advantaged the Conservatives because of their bankroll, where they could have spent a ton more money, been a ton more aggressive digitally, traditional media, impounding the living hell out of others pre-writ. And I'm not surprised that we saw that get shut down, because that was a place where it was starting to materially affect election outcomes.
Well, no, but we had money to spend.
That's not a criticism, Jenny. I just think that was.
And I know it wasn't, but even though the other parties didn't have the money to spend pre-writ, and we can get into a whole different podcast on this, but then you had the unions that were running massive campaigns against the Conservatives. So you can remember leading into the 2015 campaign, the major the unions running campaigns, running ads against Harper, working families in 2011. I would argue the most effective ads in 2011 against Tim Hudak were the working family ads. So it's not just political parties spending.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add to that on the impact on election side. I'll just sum it up by saying having money doesn't mean you'll win. Not having it almost certainly means you'll lose. I'll take up the different side of the question is, does it have an impact on politicians' decision-making? And up until 5 years ago, I would always have said no to that question, because my experience was only at the federal level, where money was very limited and fundraising was pretty limited, and the money was pretty remote from the politicians. And the example I will give is that in all of the many, many discussions that were held about whether or not to approve the bank mergers back in the 1990s, and I was in the most political of those discussions, not once was it ever raised how much the banks contributed to the Liberal Party and whether that money was in jeopardy. It just was not remotely a consideration, and I'm certain that Paul Martin had no idea which bank gave what money to the Liberal Party and didn't care. When I got to Ontario, I have to say the system that was reformed a couple of years into Kathleen Wynne's mandate, a lot of people have trouble with it because it's so constraining on the ability of parties to raise money, and it quite handicapped us going into the last election. But before those reforms, what was going on in Ontario was wrong. Fundraising out of ministers' offices, ministers being acutely aware of which of their stakeholders were giving money and how much money they were giving. I didn't like that. I didn't like the look of that at all, and I'm glad that system is gone, and there should be no sliding back on that nexus between money and decision making in Ontario. Jenni, Landon Field from Saskatchewan says he's a member of the Conservative Party and he doesn't like Andrew Scheer. Okay. But he would love some insight on the not continuing to campaign for the CPC leadership. Does the panel think that any of the four contenders could even have a chance of becoming PM? Landon Field seems disappointed with his choices for Conservative leader.
Well, Landon, you are not alone among conservative supporters that I have spoken to. I think that one of the things that the conversation, and we've talked about this, the conversation that conservatives are having among themselves right now is that whether how far the leadership race is pushed off to. Like, I know May 1st is the day that the party's going to come back to the table and decide when they're going to have it. There were still people that were arguing that we could still have the race in July. I think that ship has essentially sailed. But I think what this does is gives the opportunity to open up the field and see if there are new people out there, or people that would have said no are in a different position to be able to run. Because there is general unhappiness with all of the candidates out there. A lot of people, Leslyn Lewis is the person that I have a lot of people that will say, I'm going to vote for her. Because I think McKay's run a terrible campaign. I don't see O'Toole being able to do it. So I think that, Landon, you are absolutely with where the vast majority of conservatives I speak to are.
Scott, despite the fact that we mocked Peter MacKay's campaign every week on this podcast, you know as well as I do that he could win, right? Win an election. He could win. He could be prime minister, right?
You read my mind. That's exactly where I was going to start. I was going to start with that point on it, which is that it would be hubris and stupidity to dismiss the likelihood that any of these people might win the leadership and win election in a general campaign. You just never know, man. Like so many unpredictable outcomes have occurred, and we're living in the middle of a almost unprecedented point of disruption. It's not just economic disruption, social disruption. It will manifest as political disruption also. It is already, and it will become more pronounced. So who knows? That being said, by all the laws of gravity, Peter MacKay has been running a shit campaign, and he's looked almost all of his public interventions since this so-called campaign began and when it started overlapping with the crisis have been brutal. And I think have received, among non-conservative voters, have received like kind of laughter to head shakes, and among conservative voters, anywhere from kind of awkward embarrassment to head shakes, depending upon how enthusiastic you were in support of them. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch to see the demand and how the demand gets expressed within the Conservative Party for a new suite of leadership candidates, for essentially repacking the starter's pistol and firing it off again, because I think that demand is there, but I don't know how that demand gets expressed. Like, how does that leadership organization committee come to a decision, given where the existing powers that be within the party, given where they are, like how do they independently determine that this race should be scrapped and that you ought to open the floodgates for new candidates? Aren't all of the established authorities within the party going to be pushing against that? Because it's either going to be people who have a vested interest who won't be arguing vociferously, they'll only be arguing passively. And those with a vested interest, i.e. the established candidates, will be arguing heavily to maintain some variation on the existing process. So I'll be interested to see, like, it almost takes some kind of popular rebellion. Doesn't it take an alternative candidate that people can't have, that they want to have, to put this thing on fire and force that? So those are kind of questions that Jenni, like, I don't know, but I feel a passive demand, not an active demand.
Jenni, can you stop for a sec? Jenni, can you stop for a sec? While you answer that, a fellow named Steve Hastings that Scott and I know well because he was an important aide to John Turner back in the day, has gone on to have a very successful private sector career. But anyway, he asks us why the A team didn't run in the first place for the Conservative leadership. So maybe you could also address that in your question about reopening the race.
Well, I think there were different reasons. We've spoken about Pierre before. I was involved with his campaign before he dropped out. There were legitimate family. His heart wasn't in it. There were legitimate family dynamics. Ronna Ambrose decided not to run, but I think we're in a much different world right now than what we were 3 months ago. And I think that there is a lot more at stake in terms of holding the government to account over the next year and a half. So I think that there are conservatives, the Pierres, the Ronnas, the Brad Walls, the Jason Kennys. I think that there's going to be a renewed pressure within the party to be like, okay, guys, buck it up. Like we need you there. Like part of the problem, and I know we're going to get on to Parliament, and I'm just going to say one thing before I go into this, and it could segue into Peter. What is a blessing for Peter MacKay in terms of his campaign? Just to follow up on what Scott was saying, is nobody is paying attention to politics. Even conservatives, for the most part, have stopped paying attention. Like people are so unenthused and so sick of politics, and I find that it at least in our race that it stuns me. But I think there is more at stake for the party, and that's why I think that the party should look at opening up. But I'm not sure if they will. Like this is a LEOP committee that has not made the best of political decisions. They don't seem to really understand the dynamic of the party, the mindset of the party. They made the bizarre decision of pushing back the race indefinitely, but saying that like May 15th is going to be the membership cutoff. Like, what does that even mean? Like, there's never races. We've said before, like you always have race, like you have the election day and then you work backwards for membership cutoff. So I'm not sure it's going to, we'll see what they end up doing. It'll have to be pressure from within the party. I don't think it'll end up being one candidate, at least not now. But the problem the Conservatives are having, and I know, and I'm now segueing into a different topic, David, so I apologize if I'm getting ahead of myself. But the problem the problem the Conservatives are having in terms of like, the debate on whether to reopen Parliament, besides the fact that nobody really cares, is I truly believe the government needs to be held to account. I think there's genuine questions that need to be asked of the government in terms of the decisions they're making, the implementation of things like the wage subsidy program. Trudeau every day is becoming more breathy, as in like he's an actor going to a stage. Like, oh, hi everyone. I just want to say we're all in this together, and it's Sunday, so I'm going to speak to the children of the nation. Like, he's becoming more breathy and saying nothing. But the problem the Conservatives have isn't that there is a question period. I think question period helps Trudeau because he can like condense things to a 30-second answer, is because Andrew Scheer has zero credibility. They have zero credibility in terms of their main spokesperson on this, and the NDP are essentially the same. Jagmeet Singh has no credibility on this at all. That's ultimately the problem. The problem isn't whether there's question period. The problem is the opposition has no credibility. So that ultimately goes into why the race needs to be reopened.
Can you clarify something for me? I mean, I didn't think the government was against question period. What is the exact point that Scheer is and the Conservatives are arguing should be different about Parliament than what's going on?
They're saying that
they
were saying that there should be more in-person question periods, accountability sessions, as opposed to the one in-person per week and then two others virtually. They're saying that if construction workers on Parliament Hill and others can work, there's no and Liberal cabinet ministers can come in every day for press conferences, then people can come in for question period, which I agree with. I think the government's position that this is just unsafe is the worst argument. Against it.
Yeah, I don't. I think the Conservatives have a problem with their messenger for sure, because he does lack credibility, and not only that, he doesn't comport himself very effectively. But I think that their biggest problem is the argument that they're making doesn't track with people. I think it is lost on most people why you would subject all the support staff, all the translation staff, all the other kinds of staff to be forcibly in that place. I just saw your naked knee, by the way, Jenni. I just want to make sure that people can take at this point and go and get a candidate themselves. But I don't see why they make that argument. Like I would argue for increased committee meetings. I would argue for other ways in which you genuinely are holding the government to account and concede on the virtuality of it, if you will. But by making their line in the sand around physical encounter, I think they really undermine it, and they're isolated politically, and therefore, I think they look stupid, and I just think that's that. I just want to
Scott, you know that one of the reasons why the message isn't tracking with people is that people don't care about our institutions the same way that people who are involved in them do, and they don't respect what they do. And so they would happily let a whole bunch of really important things slide because they don't see a significance to them, but there is one. Parliament and parliamentary accountability is one of those things, isn't it?
Yes, it is. That's why I say if I was advising them, I think the fundamental points are correct. Like, you absolutely must have accountability. You must have parliamentary scrutiny. That's why I would expand the number of committees that are working. I would expand all that arena, but I would do it virtually. I would concede on the virtual point in order to rob the others of the argument that I'm being insensitive to the danger in which we're placing a bunch of the support workers. Take that off the table, then you can actually highlight the importance of the accountability. Right now it's getting lost in a health argument, and the Conservatives can't make headway, and I think they're fighting the wrong fight in the wrong place, and they look foolish. And I think that's what you get when you get someone who, what is the source of Scheer's legitimacy? I don't understand why conservatives aren't calling in and saying, hey, knock this off. Like, we're blowing political capital on a fight that doesn't make sense. Put it here. Put it in this other place. And so I think, bad leaders make bad decisions, and he's been a bad leader since the day he took over.
I think we talked about it last week. The decision to, bring his wife and kids. Someone said to me his child army on the Challenger last week was a bad decision. I think his press conference yesterday that was basically running parallel with the update and the briefings on what happened, the shootings in Nova Scotia was completely tone deaf. But my sense is the decisions now being made, I think they're all Andrew. I think that political staff are going through the motions with this guy, right. But because he's gone, I think the decisions are, I think these are Andrew's decisions.
Surely that's not true of Ian Brody. He's taken a leave to do this thing, and he's, obviously a very impressive, thoughtful guy who's trying to direct this thing.
I can't believe that. Listen, Ian, I have known for over 20 years. He was a Reform riding president in London North Centre in the late 90s. When I first met him, he was my first boss in the Prime Minister's office. I do not believe that he could be advising the Conservatives on what they're doing.
Can I just pick up on one last thing?
Two things before we. Okay. What's that?
I just wanted to pick up. I wanted to pick up on one thing Jenni said. So it'll be three things in total. Going back to your point, though, Jenni, about McKay and no one's paying attention. I think this begs a lifelong, an eternal political question. If you shit your pants and you're in a car by yourself, doesn't it still stink? And just because he's not on a bus full of people as he shits himself, I'm not sure it works out. I think he still has shit in his trousers, and I think people will notice. So we'll see. That principle is going to get tested, but I think he's been shitting his pants, and in any situation, in a crowd of any size, shitting your pants is bad.
Well, I got nothing to top that, but I'll just say two things. First of all, there's a snowstorm outside my window, which is depressing.
Oh, gosh.
The second thing is I'm not sure the leadership matters very much. This government is still in the middle stages of what would be a normal term of office for a Canadian government. And the election is likely to happen in the next year or two. I think I'm a big believer in the cycle. Somebody that's tried to extend it and somebody that's tried to truncate it. I'm a big believer in the power of the cycle. And I think that whoever leads the Conservative Party in the very next election is going to have a very uphill battle to win. And whoever leads the Conservative Party in the election after that is the odds-on favorite to win.
I think, and we're going on to probably different topics. I think every incumbent government in this country is going to have a challenge getting reelected, because right now we are now seeing the shift from people being concerned with healthcare and how it affects them from a health perspective with COVID to the economic side. And I think that between that and what people see as the hypocrisy with politicians, I think almost every and there are exceptions. I think every incumbent government will have a challenge getting reelected depending on when their elections are.
All right. Put your hair, shirts, and humble pie hats on, because we have a question from W.S. Thurlow.
What a kicker name.
It is. That is a two-parter. What is one decision your boss or bosses made that you argued vociferously in favor of that turned into an absolute nightmare? And what is one decision that your bosses made that you argued vociferously against that turned out really well. So in what case was your bad advice taken, and in what case was your bad advice disregarded? Scott, you must have a million examples.
I mean, I could just hold my diary up and it would be like one long list of bad decision taken, bad decision followed, bad result as a consequence. Well, I mean, on the bad advice that I get, we've talked about the one really spectacular example of that, David, already on this podcast, and that was during the leaders' debate in the one election campaign. We told him it would be a good idea to borrow. And I remember vehemently believing this thing, it would be a good idea to use the platform that is a national debate when you've got more people watching than ever, more people watching than any ad gets consumed, and use that to introduce a new public policy proposal that we know already people like. And that was to abolish the notwithstanding clause. And it literally went completely sideways. And the second it occurred, I was like, oh my God. Oh my God. I've asked him to jump into a pool without water. I don't know what I could have been thinking. So that was and we talked about it before.
In fairness to us, we were trying to do a quadruple bank shot at that point.
Yeah. But there's no, in fairness to us part. Like, I mean, it was a disastrous idea. It was fucking boneheaded. I'll give you the example of something that the Prime Minister felt very strongly about that I argued against, not in the terms of the question of vociferously or opposed, I thought was a terrible mistake, but something that, to my ongoing shame, to be honest, and regret, that I didn't support, which was that when Paul started championing the idea of the Kelowna Accord, I have to be candid, and my private advice was caution. I was very reluctant, not because I didn't support the principles of the Kelowna Accord. I supported them strongly, very strongly, and the idea of reconciliation and filling gaps with Aboriginal and Indigenous communities. But I was very anxious about whether or not it could succeed. So my political advice was, we're going to find ourselves in the middle of process hell. We're going to get halfway through a marsh. We're going to sink. And we've already got a bunch of FedProv processes underway. And I was anxious about the political implications of it. I didn't think it would succeed. I didn't think we'd end up with getting an agreement. And so I was always privately skeptical. I was surprised and delighted when it occurred. I was devastated and upset when we lost, because it didn't proceed, and then Harper killed it. Jenni can tell us that was the right thing to do, and I'll believe to my dying day it was a fucking terrible and awful decision. But look, that's the honest story, is that, Paul believed desperately, deeply within his bones that he wanted to do that. It was something he wanted to do before he got into politics. It was something he cared about when he was finance minister, and when he was prime minister, it didn't matter whether we were circling the drain or not. He was determined that he was going to do that. And my political objections to the process and likelihood of success meant the square root of sweet fuck all to him, and that's to his credit.
Excellent answers. I know that in the aftermath of 9/11, I had read too much Samuel Huntington and not enough anything else. And I was strongly urging Paul Martin that he needed to come out in support of the Iraq War. That was my sense of what was both the right thing and the politics of the situation. And I did not understand that the U.S. government was capable of such a massive lie about weapons of mass destruction. And so Paul's instincts were better than mine, and he knew somehow, just as Mr. Chrétien did, that this was a bad idea that was going to end up in a bad place. And so he didn't take my advice on that. And I think that it would be a general consensus, not with me, so I'm not actually admitting this, and I would argue it to this day, but anybody else sitting in this chair would say that the worst piece of advice I ever gave that was taken was to create the Gomery inquiry. Jenni.
So I was thinking about this. There were obviously heated debates over a lot of things. I think probably what would stick out is in 2008, the fall economic statement, adding the removing the political subsidy to the fall economic statement after not campaigning on it. It obviously started a domino effect for us. I wasn't ferocious in arguing to put it in there, although I will say I supported putting it in there. most people around the table did. There were a few that argued against it, and then of course it turned out to cause uproar among the opposition, and they almost formed a coalition. It ended up turning out positively for us, but those were a very tense 2 weeks. That period was a very tense 2 weeks. We legitimately, there were 3 or 4 days where I thought, okay, we're going to go down, and this is going to be this is nuts. So
I've told you my Corey story before, Corey Tenek's story, right? I'll just repeat it for people that Jenni knows it, but David knows it. But I was in Ottawa the day that thing broke, and the opposition announced that they had a coalition. They held a press conference. I happened to be in Ottawa. I was on the Quebec side. I was at a conference, and about 2:00 in the afternoon, like all this is going up. So the conference is blowing up. People are watching this, think, holy smokes, the government's going to fall. They've the opposition have banded together. It's 1979. Holy crow, you know what's going to happen here? And I get this phone call, and it's from Corey, who at the time is Director of Communications to Harper. And he's like, hey, I heard you're in town. And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, well, let's go get a beer. And I'm like, well, I'd love to have a beer, but it's 2:00 in the afternoon and you're on fucking fire, buddy. So you can't have a beer. And he's like, dude, pay attention to the news. The government is going to fall, right? I am definitely going for a beer. We're done for. So now the only sensible thing to do is to have a drink. So I hope Corey doesn't mind me telling that story. Like you, he rallied after a couple of days, and I've heard lots of fascinating behind the scenes stories, which I'd love to pluck your mind about sometime, Jenni, about how that rally came about. But
I'll tell you,
must have been a hell of a time.
The TSN turning point was it was of course the first week of December, and it was a very, for me, the week was very intense. That week, my mom was also diagnosed with terminal cancer. It literally, the day the coalition stuff started, my mom was in the hospital. I was going back and forth from Parliament Hill to the General with my mom. Oh. And so the TSN turning point was we had a really rough couple days, and there was a question period where the PM was a bit off. Our ministers were off. You were in the lobby, and it was morose. People were there were a lot of sad faces there. And the turning point was our Christmas party was that night. And I remember going because I felt it had to be all hands on deck. And the Prime Minister came, him and Loreen walked up to the stage, and he got a 7-minute standing ovation. It was 7 minutes, and I'm not even exaggerating. It was 7 minutes, and he delivered a great speech. But that was literally the moment that changed everything, because you had all these staffers that felt that things had changed, or that we were all in this together. The PM realized he had this army of people that wanted to fight. The next day, we started the rallies, and that literally was the most. I even remember the clothes I was wearing that night when it happened.
David, if we ever have the time, we should do a full-on dedicated prorogation looking back episode, because I have 3 or 4 great stories from that time too. I can remember when the day that the speeches, the national addresses by the leaders, and I was doing live television coverage, but getting calls from both Dion's office and from Leighton's office, and I mean, so that would be fun to go.
I would love to. I've got there's one story in mind. If we were doing one, there's one that I'd love to talk about around the conference, the NDP conference call that we inadvertently got invited on.
It would be fun to talk about in a way, but Scott, we have about 10 close friends whose reputations would be ruined.
But our reputations take such a shit kicking. It's just fun to sort of point out that others have been historically stupid errors also.
All right. Doug Little, I think a little mischievously, because he's commented before that we don't have an end dipper on this panel, has asked us 3 experts, what about the NDP? Any chance for a Leighton-style breakthrough? Jenni, you've witnessed a Leighton-style breakthrough. What do you think?
I'm not sure how there could be a Leighton-style breakthrough. we have the same, like, I don't see any chance that there is going to be that. I think that, Jagmeet Singh, like Jack, at least every election would increase the seats for the party. Singh lost half their seats, and has proven to not be effective in Parliament, to not be effective with the media. I think there is a 0% chance of an NDP style breakthrough.
Scott?
Wow. I was impressively definitive. I guess I'm more of a scaredy cat. I think, like, in theory, naturally, there's always a chance. No one saw Layton's breakthrough coming, at least, and not Layton either. They can say that they did, but that's all horseshit. They didn't. I think there's, in order for that to happen, generally speaking, maybe the future will prove us wrong, you need at least two preconditions. You need, one, liberal weakness. For the NDP to rally and to fill, they need to fill a space that has been absented by the Liberals. And the combination of Ignatius' leadership and an increasing weakness within the party, it created that. So we don't have that right now. So you have to imagine that Trudeau effectively takes himself out. Like, Trudeau would have to topple Trudeau in order to create that space. So that's not impossible, I suppose, to imagine. But you have to imagine that from whole cloth, because nothing suggests that is in motion right now. So that's the first thing you would need as a precondition for a huge rebirth, a la Layton. And the second thing you need is a piece of geography, like a piece of political real estate that you own and that you have as yourselves, whether it's a constituency, whether it's a region of the country. But and one of the greatest challenges I think that the current NDP have, and that they fail to really reconcile themselves to, is, at least there was a coherence to Mulcair's leadership. The idea was, well, we will build off of our Quebec foundation. That's the foundation of the party now. We'll get a Quebec leader, we'll moderate ourselves, and we'll make ourselves palatable as a national party. That's all gone now. And so there's no piece of geography, there's no constituency, they don't have that fundamental cornerstone building block right now as a party. And that's what in the midst of all this, if I was working for the NDP, that would be my obsession. I'd be saying, coming out of this, what's the foundation stone that we can lay that we build? Like, is it in BC?
Well, what
is
about,
it
Scott,
in
what
urban
about
Canada?
what about, I mean, there is, I think, likely to be a big appetite among a certain segment, not the entire population, among a certain segment, for a more activist government, for, as I said earlier, rebuilding a more robust social safety net, a whole bunch of things that would be associated with the left side of the spectrum. Is the Liberal government going to be able to lead that charge, or will it be caught in the middle of that debate?
Well, my answer is there's no indication.
If they're caught in the middle, does that create room for the NDP? That's my question.
Maybe, but I see no indication that this Liberal government is unwilling to occupy that space, and won't, even if it gets it wrong in the first instance, won't tack into that space very quickly. And then you get into classic conundrums. If the NDP lead with policy proposals that they think more closely attuned to the public, then the Liberals may just steal them and make them their own. If they don't lead and husband those things, then try to wait for the Liberals to stumble. And if the Liberals don't stumble sufficiently, then the space doesn't exist. So I think you want to be part of that debate, but I'm not convinced that I think it's more theoretical than practical that it's their opening on this thing.
But I think
their leader, whoever it is, whether it's Singh or somebody else, needs to be far more literate on economic policy and sound like they really know what they're talking about in order to be an effective leader of a change, of a policy change mandate. I don't think they've got the leadership right now that can inspire Canadians to be confident in their prescription for the economy. Jenni?
I agree with you on that. I think the only hope they have is going back to the point I made, that I think every incumbent government, because I don't think Canadians have fully comprehended how bad the economy is, and how this is, once we are allowed out of our homes, how bad this is for the economy. And I think that that is the only hope that the NDP has. That is a hope for Conservatives, and that is going to be a problem that every government has. And so I think for the Trudeau government, it goes back to, like, we're still not seeing the wage subsidy program being rolled out. They keep pushing it back. With the Ontario government, Doug is folksy and thanks everyone. I was actually joking. It's like you remember the movie, the Campaign with Will Ferrell, in the starting scene, he's thanking everyone. And I feel like Doug it's like, because Filipino tilt-a-whirl operators are this nation's backbone. Like that's basically where I feel like he's at. And don't even get me started with John Tory trying to keep everyone in their homes and like ticketing. I have a friend that was ticketed for like walking on the edge of edge of a park, and yet he goes out with a giant fucking parade on Sunday night with no face mask, like basically spitting on nurses as he's like thanking them for all the work that they do. So
Spitting on nurses. God, you hate God. Oh, you're so rough on John. It's unfair, man.
I actually personally like John very much.
That's obvious.
Yeah, that comes through. For sure. Talking about his boners, talking about spitting on people. I think to myself, God, I wish I had a friend who would talk about me in such charitable terms.
I'm just saying it is going to be the economy and then eventually the hypocrisy of politicians that I think is going to drive what Canadians are thinking. So I guess what I'm trying to say, to go back to the start, is that could be a saving grace for Jagmeet Singh.
Back to the shit your pants principle. If you're going to shit your pants in a car with no one else.
Jenni, we're going to end on a question that gets posed to you, but I suspect we'll all opine on it.
Okay.
Kim Cable from Ottawa says, I listen to the podcast all the time. Thank you, Kim. And my question is about Jenni's views on Trump. Is she defending the legitimacy of his presidency, or is she actually supportive of his policies and views? I really can't tell. If she's playing devil's advocate to Scott's disdain, that's one thing and funny as hell. But if she actually sees admirable qualities in Trump or his policies, I struggle to understand. Please ask her to explain.
Well, I can't think of a worse like as someone that's worked for several politicians over the last 20 some years, I can't imagine imagine being a political staffer for Donald Trump. It like every day you'd be like, what the fuck? The legitimacy of his president, he was elected by over 60 million Americans. Like, it's not up to any of us to say whether it's legitimate or not. He won. In terms of his policies, some I agree with, and some I think are I don't agree with. There seems to be two Trumps, though. There's the Trump policies, the actual orders and policies that he puts in, and the Trump on Twitter. And it's almost like he has a persona that distracts everyone and makes people crazy, like you guys, from the fact that he's actually enacting some policies. Like his tweet last night that he's shutting down all immigration to the U.S. Well, the borders are closed. He's not shutting down any current applications in process or what have you. But it gets everyone like talking and somewhat crazy. And now immigration and globalization and isolationism is going to end up being an election issue, which will benefit him. I look at Trump as I tried it with Trump. I try to be. I don't agree with, as I said, everything he does, but I try to also be honest in terms of why he's doing it and what the effects are going to be. Like, they put out the Republicans put out an ad yesterday on Nancy Pelosi. And it goes back to the hypocrisy of politicians. So she's criticizing, there are two ads they put out. One on Joe Biden saying that Trump should have shut down the economy or shut down the borders 2 weeks earlier because even though Biden was holding major rallies himself 2 weeks prior to the March 16th shutdown. So you've got the hypocrisy there. And they had a video with Nancy Pelosi talking to some media outlet where she's sitting behind two $24,000 restaurant-style fridges in her kitchen and showing people the 18 quarts of $15 ice cream that she has in her is in her fridge. So I think that this is the Democrats' problem. They have to actually acknowledge that their deficiencies and where Trump is actually successful if they're ever going to beat him in the next election. Long answer, sorry, very long-winded.
It's a great answer. What's the thing that he's done that you disagree with?
Well, listen, I think his constant, I think the constant tweeting is unbecoming to him as well as any politician. But it seems to work for him. As I said, I've come to the conclusion it's an absolute distraction. It's almost like, Beyonce has an alter ego, Sasha Fierce, when she goes on stage to perform, and it's almost like Donald Trump's Twitter is his alter ego.
I agree with your characterization of the two kinds of things. And my problem is that I think I hate the policy agenda as much or more as I hate the public persona. But you're right. He completely, with his Twitter activity, distracted people from the fact that he gave $1 trillion to the richest people in America. Scott, last thoughts on Trump before we go.
Well, first of all, I know Kim Cable, so I should give a shout out. They're on the outskirts of Ottawa. Kim and I went to high school together. So Kim and Jeff and their neighbors Bonnie and Kevin, we all went to school together in Belleville, Ontario.
You can tell that our audience is basically a friends and family operation.
No question. But we all know my view, right? I think that Trump is. I don't make those distinctions, and I think that. Yeah, on those rare occasions where I think that a policy or statement from him is not wholly unacceptable, it's probably been manufactured elsewhere. And even then, his character is so overwhelmingly disqualifying that I'm not interested in anything he does. I just think everything we hear, it's just a river of hate and horseshit from this guy. And he needs to be defeated. And he is a manifest threat to his own population, the world's population. That's becoming more evident every day. And I just wish he would fucking vanish like a doomed assistant in a bad magician's trick.
He's going to be.
He's so reliable, Jenny. He always says exactly what I'm thinking.
I look forward to the $1,000 when he beats Sleepy Joe in November.
I'm gonna spend that $1,000.
Everybody, that's been the Herle Burly for this week. Ken Bosencool and Kevin Milligan, thank you for coming on and being so informative for people. Scott and Jenny, thank you for all you do all the time. And to the Air Quotes media team that's working really hard behind the scenes, and especially Michael Spitali, who's had just a shit week. Thank you all. And thank everybody for listening, and we'll be back at you next week.
Okay.
It was great. Great. That was fun. Viewer mailbag was a great idea. Oh, shit, I forgot the outro. Wait a second. Let me record this while we're still going. And as an added bonus this week, every time our recording engineer, Metal Donkersgood, is listening to and record and doing his magic on this podcast, his son Dax comes into the room and sings and dances to the tune that Ray Martini wrote and performed for this podcast. And we've got a little video glimpse for you of Dax rocking out to Ray Martini.